What's the war in Lebanon really about? I'm sure you've seen the headlines. The Shia militia group Hezbollah firing rockets into Israel. Israel flattening a building in central Beirut and sending troops into southern Lebanon. About 20% of Lebanon's population has been displaced. There's a version of this that feels like deja vu. Israel and Hezbollah at war again. But this time it could be different from the BBC. I'm Tristan Redman in London with my co-host Asma Khalid in Washington, D.C., and you're watching The Global Story on YouTube. I'm Hugo Machega. I am a Middle East correspondent based in Beirut, and I've been here since October 2023. So it's been very busy. What's life like in Beirut right now, Hugo? It's a city on edge. The streets are quieter. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty because nobody knows what is going to happen. Earlier today we had this attack that hit a building in central Beirut. And this building is just 10 minutes from my flat. So I was woken up by the sound of a huge explosion. The windows in my flat range rattled. So this gives you a sense of how powerful this explosion was. And I think this is the uncertainty that we have at the moment, which is feeding the anxiety that people have that nobody really knows what is going to happen. Hugo, you're joining us, as you say, from Beirut, and some listeners may be wondering what Lebanon has to do with the war in Iran, which we have been discussing day after day here on our show on The Global Story. Can you take us back to about 2.5 weeks ago, the US and Israel began a war with Iran. And within days we started seeing reports of another front of this war in Lebanon. How did that happen? Yeah, I think the right way to look at this conflict is to understand that this is a long-running conflict between Israel and Hezbollah with lots of chapters. And this particular chapter started when Hezbollah launched rockets into Israel to respond to the killing of the Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Hezbollah is obviously supported by Iran. It is financed, backed, armed by Iran. So there is a very strong link between Hezbollah and Iran. It was a very symbolic response by Hezbollah. But Israel used this attack as a justification to carry out large-scale attacks against Hezbollah. Because before this chapter there was a ceasefire in Lebanon because of another conflict that happened here back in 2024. But Israel continued to carry out attacks almost every day. The Israelis were saying that Hezbollah was trying to rebuild its capabilities. Hezbollah was saying that Israel wasn't respecting this deal that he had signed. So I think for all of us here in Lebanon, for quite some time, there was the idea that another conflict between Israel and Hezbollah was inevitable. We've been seeing the coverage of the huge number of displaced people in Lebanon. Around 1 million people or so, 20% of the population. Huge numbers of people. What are you seeing playing out in front of you? Yeah, so again, we're talking about, as you say, 1 million people who've been displaced. And this is a tiny country, this has, a massive impact all across the country because of youth you have. The vast majority of these people are coming from Shia communities, which are the bulk of Hezbollah's support base. And to understand what happens in Lebanon, you need to understand that this is a country with deep sectarian division. So you have a Shia community, you have Sunni community, you have the Christians. They live separate in some places. And now we're seeing that Shia Muslims are being driven away from their communities and now being forced to seek refuge in other parts of the country. So this is creating sectarian divisions as well. If you go to Martyr Square, which is the main square here in central Beirut, you see many tents there with families with nowhere to go. There were some people sleeping on the Corniche by the Mediterranean Sea in central Beirut in the first stages of the war. People were sleeping in their cars because they believed that they would be allowed to go back to their homes. And a lot of people have been displaced, not for the first time. People who perhaps had their houses destroyed back in 2024, had returned to their homes and now being forced to flee again. And obviously, there is the fear that this could lead to a deep humanitarian crisis. This is a country that's been in a state of permanent crisis for almost a decade. And I remember when I got here back in 2023, one of the first people I interviewed was a woman who said, "I'm exhausted, because if you look at what's happened in this country, you had a huge economic crisis back in 2019, and that was followed by the port explosion in 2020, the pandemic, then a war. And it's been like this for many, many years. So people are very, very tired." Well, Hugo, we've been hearing the last few days about an Israeli ground operation in southern Lebanon. What does that actually look like? What are they trying to achieve? Yeah, this is interesting because up until now, the Israelis are describing what is happening in the south as targeted, limited ground incursions, operations. I think we can talk. We can describe it as being an invasion because Israeli troops inside Lebanon. I think the fear here is that this could be the beginning of a large-scale ground invasion and perhaps an occupation of southern Lebanon. We had another warning by the Israeli military urging residents of the south to leave those areas near the border. So roughly a fifth of the country is now under this evacuation warning by the Israeli military. And again, I think a lot of people are very concerned here that this is going to be different than 2024, that the Israelis are coming here, that they're going to stay because they think that they need to really destroy whatever is there of Hezbollah infrastructure and try to push Hezbollah away from the border. And Hugo, you recently wrote a story with a headline that caught my attention. The headline said, "Battered and isolated Hezbollah drags Lebanon into another war." And it was that word, that verb in particular, that caught my attention. Drags. It has seemed for a long time now that Hezbollah makes decisions that affect the entire Lebanese population, at times more so perhaps even than the Lebanese government itself. Can you tell us about the origin of Hezbollah and how it initially emerged? So Hezbollah was created in Lebanon to fight the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon during the Lebanese civil war back in the 80s. And that occupation happened because the Israelis were fighting Palestinian groups based in southern Lebanon. Large numbers of people in the Shia community were displaced in southern Lebanon because of the Israeli invasion. Shia villages in the south were destroyed, and the Shias had long been underrepresented in politics here. So that's when Hezbollah emerges. They enjoy a lot of support, significant support in the Shia community, because back in the 80s, and very similar situation to what we're seeing right now. And from the very beginning, Hezbollah has been financed, armed and trained by Iran. And to this day, the destruction of Israel remains one of Hezbollah's official goals. So Israel occupied southern Lebanon in the 80s and that occupation continued, my understanding is for a number of years. The Israelis only left southern Lebanon in 2000. So you have the Lebanese Civil War. After 15 years of a brutal civil war, finally you had a deal. But the Israeli occupation continued up until the year 2000. Hugo, we've been referring to Hezbollah as a military organization, one that you say some Lebanese see as a resistance group. It is also designated as a terrorist organization by countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. But it strikes me also that there is a political arm of Hezbollah. I remember years ago visiting Lebanon and seeing the Hezbollah flag. It is an organization that provides sort of political organizing and social services for a number of people. Is that not right? In 1990, there was a deal that ended the civil war. And this deal stipulated that all militias in the country should be disarmed. But despite that, Hezbollah managed to remain armed. And also this deal consolidated the division of power here in Lebanon, which is based on sectarianism, which means that the president is always a Maronite Christian, the prime minister is always a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament is always from the Shia community. And on top of that, senior positions in the cabinet, in the government are also based on sex. So this helps you understand why Hezbollah is part of the government. The health and labor ministers come from Hezbollah. And also in the 90s, Hezbollah started its transformation, if you like. It became a political power, and it became a political party, and because of its strong support in the Shia community, became an extremely power. It has a significant parliamentary bloc. They have been able to essentially dictate policies in this country. And they have been very clear in terms of telling people who oppose whatever they want to do that they could suffer the consequences. So they would send armed men into the streets. They would sometimes be accused of killing their rivals, and that anyone that, could try to stop them or, put some barriers or obstacles in the things they were trying to do that they would, there would be consequences for that. And that helps us, understand why, Hezbollah is so powerful and why it's been so difficult for the government to take decisions against it. So, Hugo, you mentioned this multi-year operation in which Israel invaded southern Lebanon. This was in the 80s. It continued up until 2000. And then I recall in 2006, there was another ground operation the Israelis undertook in Lebanon. Can you remind us what started that? So this was a war that was triggered by a deadly ambush of Israeli soldiers by Hezbollah. It happened, on the border between the two countries. And there was a massive Israeli response. Israel attacked Hezbollah's military targets across the country, but also civilian infrastructure. And there was another ground invasion of southern Lebanon by Israel. It was an extremely destructive, deadly conflict. And it ended after 34 days with a United Nations resolution called 1701, which demanded Hezbollah's disarmament. That obviously hasn't happened, but Hezbollah saw this conflict as a victory. And many believe that this was the moment that Hezbollah became more confident, more powerful and more confrontational. And they really consolidated their position as the most powerful force here in Lebanon. They built a formidable fighting force. They had sophisticated weapons. As that happened, those sectarian divisions that I mentioned earlier became deeper. So on one side, you have the Shia community supporting Hezbollah, saying that the state was unable to protect them and that Hezbollah is the only force capable to confront Israel. And on the other side, essentially everyone else accusing Hezbollah, as you say, of dragging Lebanon into unnecessary wars, in their view of putting Iran's interests above, Lebanon's interests, causing a lot of suffering and destruction here. And this is again the debate that is playing out right now in this country, Hugo, after that ceasefire. After the conflict with Israel in 2006, there's a truce, but it's kind of an uneasy truce, isn't it? Because things flare up again over the years. I remember lots of flare-ups and incursions by Israeli forces and firing of rockets into Israel from Lebanon. But then after the October 7th attacks by Hamas into Israel, Hezbollah starts firing of rockets into Israel. What happens next? And why was this such a pivotal moment? This was a decision taken by Hezbollah. A decision that now even some of its supporters say was a miscalculation by Hezbollah. They decided to show solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza after Israel launched its destructive response to the Hamas attacks. So we had those attacks by Hezbollah for almost a year. This was a conflict that was largely contained to areas along the border. And then everything changed in September 2024. And I think a lot of people remember the pager attacks. It was something that was unthinkable when pagers that were being used by Hezbollah members, not only fighters, but like teachers, nurses. I met a nurse who had a pager, and the pager exploded as he was, starting his shift at a hospital, and he lost, 3 fingers in one of his hands. And, it was devastating because, some of the pages exploded when people were, with their families in the supermarket, driving. So that was the beginning of a larger conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. And a day later, walkie-talkies being used by Hezbollah members exploded. And I was reporting from the Dahir district when we heard a huge explosion. It was a walkie-talkie that had exploded right next to us. Oh, wow, it was a funeral that was happening for one of the victims of the pager attacks. And then the walkie-talkies exploded. And I think that was, that not only surprised everybody, but I think it was shocking for many people, not only Hezbollah supporters, but I think for a lot of people in Lebanon, because it really showed how, the level of penetration of Hezbollah and the intelligence that Israel had about essentially everything that was happening inside the group. And right after that, there was the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. This was the man that led Hezbollah for 30 years. And he was not only, the Secretary General, if you like, of Hezbollah, but he was somebody who was seen as, as a big figure. People would hold posters with the pictures of Hassan Nasrallah with his face. This kind of, marked the end of an era for Hezbollah because obviously his successor, Naim Qassem, isn't seen as popular or charismatic. And everything has changed now after his killing. And obviously, Hezbollah is a diminished organization right now. There has been a change in terms of how Hezbollah is seen domestically in Lebanon. I think before the war, people would criticize Hezbollah, but if you would go to Shia communities, people wouldn't, be very vocal, even though, they could oppose or be against some of Hezbollah's decisions. But they will never really express those views. And I felt last year, visiting some communities in the south, that was changing. There was a lot of anger at the beginning of this conflict because even people inside the Shia community were blaming Hezbollah for dragging Lebanon into this conflict. So I was, last year, last year on the first anniversary of the ceasefire, we spent days in the south of the country going to those villages that had been, completely destroyed near the border. And I met a man who was the last, residents. And, I asked him, aren't you afraid of being here? And he told me that he was very, very scared. We've got every reason to be afraid because, as you can see, no one else is here. You will leave in a bit, and we'll be left alone. There is a Hezbollah flag right next to your house. Do you think the Hezbollah must disarm? I find it hard that they will give it up. But one also wants to live. This is no life. So that was then. And I'm curious if people's sentiment has evolved or changed now in just these last couple of weeks with the latest war, and particularly amongst some in the Shia community who might traditionally have been, you're saying, supporters of Hezbollah. I think at the very beginning, there was this widespread anger, and I was very surprised by how widespread this anger was, including in the Shia community. I think now this is week 3 of the war. Things are changing a little bit because there is a lot of anger. Directed at Hezbollah. But there's also growing anger directed at Israel because of the mass displacement of people, because of the destruction of infrastructure, because of the attacks that are happening across the country. So I think maybe some of those people who are very angry at the beginning are now going back to the traditional positions, are saying, well, look, Hezbollah, they are here to protect us because, the aggressors are the Israelis, and this is the country that we need, to confront. Given everything you said about that widespread pager attack that killed so much of the Hezbollah leadership and the killing of Hezbollah's longtime leader, Hassan Nasrallah, I'm so confused as to how the organization then is able to continue to fight on with Israel as we're seeing right now, because the perception broadly was that this was a totally crippled organization. I think this is the big surprise here in this conflict. Talking to people who understand how Hezbollah works, they say, well, look, yes, they learned some of the lessons. They replaced some of those people who were killed. They learned from some of the mistakes, and they returned to their roots being a smaller organization and really trying to learn from everything that's happened in the last 2 years or so. And I think this is, the explanation as to why Hezbollah has been able to again carry out these attacks and continue to exist as a fighting force. And that makes me wonder, well, where's the actual Lebanese government in all of this? The Lebanese government is in a very difficult position because Lebanon is not involved in this conflict. This is Hezbollah against Israel. So we had a new government last year, and the new president, Josephine, has promised to disarm Hezbollah. The problem is that he said, we cannot do it by force. It needs to be through a diplomatic process. Hezbollah agreed as part of the ceasefire deal to remove its fighters and its weapons from the south of the country, but has refused to discuss the future of its weapons elsewhere in the country. Hezbollah has not only a very strong presence in the south, but also in the east, in the Bekaa Valley. Lots of weapons, rockets, missiles and all the rest of it. And they say, we're not going to talk about it as long as Israel is attacking us. So it is a catch-22 situation. The Lebanese president has been very concerned, and he's been saying to all those people who say, look, you need to send Lebanese soldiers to disarm Hezbollah. He says, look, we need to be very careful because of those sectarian divisions, we could risk sparking domestic unrest and the possibility of internal conflict. So it is a very difficult situation for the Lebanese authorities in terms of the Israeli incursions into southern Lebanon. What's their end point? What's their aim? What are they trying to do ultimately? So what Israeli officials are saying is that this is about protecting communities in the north and they want to push Hezbollah away from the border so they don't have the ability to continue to launch these rockets. I think the assumption is that they're going to try to create a so-called buffer zone along the border. And what they've been saying is that, residents from those villages are not going to be able to return, at least for now. The Israelis say that Hezbollah uses civilian neighborhoods, civilian areas to embed its military infra. So it is very likely that we're going to see widespread destruction in those communities, in those villages because the Israelis are saying that we need to destroy what is there because this is being used by Hezbollah to attack Israel. But we simply don't know. I mean, the fear here, and this is the fear of many of Hezbollah supporters, they say, well, look, what Israel is trying to do is to occupy parts of the country to expand Israeli territory. Others say, well, look, they're just trying to create this kind of security zone buffer zone in the south. But there is the fear that this could be the beginning of a long-term operation here. But for the time being, it's not the stated Israeli aim to destroy Hezbollah entirely, as we have seen them say about, for example, Hamas in the recent past or the Iranian government right now. Are they stopping short of saying that that's what they're trying to do for the time being? I think everybody agrees that it is impossible to destroy an organization like Hezbollah. And I hope I've been able to explain that Hezbollah is much more than a military organization. So it is an ideology. And you cannot destroy an ideology with bombs. There needs to be some kind of diplomatic effort to engage with Hezbollah so they can sit down and discuss the future of their weapons. Over the last 4 decades, Hezbollah and Israel have fought with each other many times. Is there anything you're seeing that suggests this time is really different than all the other times? I think what is different now is that there is the perception that this is not going to be quick. I think the Israelis are seeing this as a window of opportunity because they have full American support for this opportunity operation. So I think this is what is different. But again, it is very difficult to see this as the final war. The fear that many Lebanese have is that this war is going to continue for quite some time, that their country is going to be under occupation again, and there will be no solution to this problem and no decision about what is going to happen with Hezbollah's weapons. Well, Hugo, thank you so much for being your reporting and your insights to us. We really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.